And at this particular point of ritual, we need to remind ourselves about the way in which language functions in terms of nature. We're conditioned to using language in a very specialized way, a limited way. And part of the function of this education is to restore the full spectrum of language and to break the bad habits of a rather limited world that has come to dominate our lives and our persons and our senses of what is real and what is true. There will be two focuses. One focus is on the inappropriateness of logic as understood in the normal, everyday, academic-based world. What usually passes for logic is a passing phase of immaturity and has nothing to do whatsoever with real logic. The second focus will be on sacred language, which is always incomprehensible or has an element of incomprehensibility. And only slowly do we build acquaintance, and the incomprehensibility fades or recedes, but never entirely goes away. And the fact that it is always concomitant with the meaning that one understands is the index to its sacredness. Now, these are 2 points that are difficult to hear coming in off the streets of Los Angeles on a Saturday morning. So let me say them more simply. There is a real logic, not the one that you have been taught. There is a sacredness to language. Part of its distinguishing mark of sacredness is that there is an incomprehensibility factor in addition to the meaning quality, which is evident. It is the height of egotistical delusion to believe that you understand completely what has been said. For if a language is curtailed enough to be able to express completely what it is saying at any given moment or time, so that someone hears it completely, it's a sign that the speaker and the listener are living in a false world. For reality is based on mystery. Nature is mysterious, and in no way, at no time, is fully comprehensible. And thus, a logic that pretends to be comprehensible perfectly and completely at every stage of its operation is a ritual of deceit. That is the tradition of the liar. Now, the juxtaposition of these 2 points, the point that there is a logic that is real and a sacred language that is always somewhat mysterious, the juxtaposition of those 2 points is the flashpoint of myth. So that myth in no way is a primitive mentality that is false because they didn't understand real logic. That myths are lies because they don't have the accuracy needed to be true, meaning logically true, and thus meaning sacred in the sense that it's perfectly logical, and that's why we know it's true, and thus that is really what sacred is, isn't it? That's a tautological short circuit that is a necklace worn by the ego and has nothing to do with the real, has nothing to do with the universe, and is a fool's game to follow, is a true rut of ignorance, and is the basic rut within which runs a endless round, a race that never ends, that no one ever wins, that just continues, which is the cycle of ignorance, which in ancient Sanskrit was called patita samutpaya, the dependent chain of origination, and that rut that is made by the circularity, the dead-end circularity of that rut that is made is called karma. And so one would like to come out of this. One would like to break out on the outside or break in on the inside and not be trapped in this rut, in this circularity of ignorance. So all ancient men and women who emerged out of nature, emerged into their existence and their life, emerged whole into it, and struggled with the disparateness between the mystery of nature and the startling exactness of existence, the zero-ness of nature and the oneness of existence. In struggling with these two aspects, they came in the realm of experience, in the realm of language, in the realm of myth. They came to be understood as a male-female ratio. A ratio of femaleness to a maleness. And that the femaleness has a contact, unbroken, with the mystery of nature, whereas the maleness has a contact which will not be let go with existence. And so in the Navajo myths of creation, first man and first woman are similar yet remarkably different because they look in different directions. The woman looks to nature, to its Tao, and feels at home and sees no need to abandon it whatsoever. Whereas the man looks to existence and likes definiteness, likes the oneness, likes unity, likes thusness. And so the man, first man, prided himself on the, this is it. Whereas first woman prided herself on the, I wonder how that would work out. And so the and the came together and made a primordial om. If you can take that on Saturday morning. What did Coppola's screenplay of Patton say? I give it to them loud and dirty so they remember it. It's an which is definite, that characterizes the male. It's a which is indefinite, which characterizes the female. The female is at home in indefiniteness. It is not a threat whatsoever. It's water to play in, to swim in. Whereas a man likes things definite, a woman likes things possible. And these two coming together in a ratio make up what is real about existence. So that there is a kind of a conundrum, there's a puzzle. That existence seems to have a male quality to it, yet includes the female possibility all the time. And existence has within it, dispersed within it, the seeds of mystery all the time, so that there is a mysterious quality to existence, even though it is definite. It is always definitely something else besides itself. If you make a square out of the academic tradition known in the West as the Aristotelian logical tradition, known in the West as that because of Aristotle's development of syllogistic logic in classical Greece, which was preemptively adopted by the Arabs who took over Hellenistic Greek civilization after the fall of Rome for many hundreds of years, and the Europeans who wanted to combat the Arabs did so by trying to steal back the Greek origins from the Arabs. And so the medieval West, under figures like Thomas Aquinas, reappropriated Aristotle in a scholasticism to take Aristotle away from the Arabs. And so the medieval Western scholastics are the ones who used a megahorn, which was never used by Aristotle or the Greeks, to broadcast a sense that logic is a square which is very definite, and one can tell true from false quite accurately by following a causal effect, a syllogistic causal effect, and that the core of the square that makes this kind of logic is polarity and analogy. The twins, the pair that go together, that constitute the square of that kind of logic, are polarity and analogy. Polarity in that yes and no are radically different, true and false are distinctly different, and that this distinct and radical difference between yes and no and true and false and black and white and male and female is held together in tandem by analogy. And so on an east-west horizon, one would have a polarity, and on a vertical north-south, one would have an analogy. And so the square of logic that pretends to be accurate since now about 700 years, a scholastic Aristotelian logic, a schoolboy's kind of learning. Our sense of language order must be placed into this squared hopper of polarity and analogy. This logic, this kind of logic, could be called a Western urban logic. Distinct from this is the kind of natural-based ritual logic of tradition. And the natural-based ritual logic of tradition has in place of analogy, it has similarity. And in place of polarity, it has reciprocity. So that tribal wisdom is quite different from scholastic wisdom. Scholastic logic is different from tribal logic. In a tribal logic, you're not concerned with polarities, but with reciprocities. And you're not concerned with analogies, you're concerned with similarities. Now, the similarities in tribal logic lead to a respect for correspondences. So all ritual tribal levels look to find truth by following correspondences that aid in the reciprocity. That makes good sense to tribal men and women. And this is true, this kind of outlook is true the world round for all primitive so-called peoples. Better to call them primordial, as we'll see, there's nothing primitive about it. Primitive in the sense that it carries on with it, unbroken from nature, a respect for the reciprocity between men and women, the reciprocity for the respect of black and white coming together, and not making just some kind of gray, but making a spectrum of color. The habit-bound mind of scholastic logic, when trying to imagine black and white coming together, only and always see gray. They do not see how color can come out of black and white together. And yet, the prismatic diffraction of white light in a so-called blackness produces a rainbow every single time. Some of the most accurate TV color comes because of the black format surrounding the color pixels. There are all kinds of examples that are quite real, are mathematically realistic, and seem irrational to the scholastic logical mind, which is actually trapped by polarity and analogy arranged as a grid. When you have reciprocity and similarity, there is a mature development that is capable out of this. And that mature capability comes in realm of vision. And in the realm of vision, there is a transformation. Reciprocity transforms into complementarity. And similarity transforms into resonance. So that in realm of vision, of consciousness, of differential consciousness, the natural tribal wisdom transforms into a very mature, conscious wisdom. A wisdom where reciprocity now becomes complementarity is able to be understood, for instance, as the Tao of physics. And where similarity comes into play as resonance, one understands that the realm of probability is more accurate to the actual nature of things than the realm of labeling and categorizing. Modern science and modern mathematics are powerful because they deal exactly with probability on infinitesimal scales, both the very large and the very small. Infinitesimally small, infinitesimally large. Approaching one, approaching zero. It's the whole basis upon which, for instance, calculus and all higher mathematics are based. That probability can be refined farther than can be an assigned category of identity. To say it in the old way that 30 years ago people would talk, your labels may be accurate when you place them on the container, but what's in the container is going to change. It's going to age. It's going to be different. And what you labeled fresh cinnamon 500 years from now is not going to be fresh cinnamon. The label will be a lie. What you label this part of the stream that can be forded after the first great flood and it moves the sand and the rocks, it may be that that's not the place to ford at all. And so what you labeled the ford is now a deep pool you're going to have trouble getting out of. So that labeling, which is the categorical act of a logic based on polarity and analogy, is extremely precarious and almost always misleading. And one could say that eventually it always misleads, because nature is in change, is a matrix of change, is in flux. So that it's much more accurate to have a sense of probability linked to a sense of possibility. So if you have a square, possibility as the horizon and probability as the vertical, one gets a working network, a navigational compass with which to ply unknown terrain or to negotiate seemingly known terrain that now is understood to change. From the scholastic logic delusion, from that point of view, looking at ritual is misseen every single time, continuously and forever. That's to make it as definite as can be. I'm covering all the possibilities. Ritual is seen to be some kind of ethnocentric illusion. That's how that tribe does these things. Aren't they stupid? And that ethnocentric illusion are really just artifacts of tradition, which is an immature attempt to try and get where we are. One is reminded of some of the lyrics of that beautiful song in the comic film Earth Girls Are Easy, where one of the stars sings a song and she says, "I'm a blonde and I have everything easy, don't you wish you were me? And what's wrong with you is that you aren't me." The "aren't you sad that you're not me" kind of mentality is the same as a prisoner looking out through the bars and not understanding that one is looking through the bars and saying, "What a defective world. It has blank spots and all these parallel verticals all the time. How can anyone stand to live out there?" As soon as someone is released from that mentality and comes outside of the categorical prison cell in which they have lived their entire lives, seemingly happily, the first thing that occurs is tremendous shame and humiliation. And the ego fears shame and humiliation more than death. And quite remarkably, the first response is to prefer to go back into the safe, secure jail and keep criticizing others rather than to remain out and remain free. It takes a while, impossible though it may seem, to acclimate people to freedom. And yet, one of the most poignant of all existential writers during the Second World War, Jean-Paul Sartre, wrote a beautiful little book called Condemned to Freedom, in which he portrayed exactly this kind of absurd conundrum, that modern man has discovered the source of his anxiety, and that is that he is really free and can't do anything about it. Has emerged out of the safe prison of traditions and cannot ever go back, and that's really the worst of all possible scenarios. Now, this kind of emergence is exactly what the Navajo creation myth is all about. About how man emerged through a phase form situation that had 4 phases to it, 4 corners to it, and came out into a 5th world, the world that we inhabit now. And that whole emergence, that whole phase form emergence was constantly a source of anxiety, and that one needs to recount in terms of tradition how this happened, to remember how it happened so as not to forget, not to slough it off, and not to seek to go back to some previous kind of situation which is no longer tenable whatsoever. Now, it's interesting to see that the Navajo creation myth, the Navajo, the Dene, those people, their 5-phase creation story is very similar to the Taoist 5-phase energy cycle. And as in the 5-phase Taoist energy cycle, the 5th phase is that of multiplicity, the world of 10,000 things. The 5th world of the Navajos is the world of present multiplicity and complexity. Now, one can look into an ethnological background and find that a lot of the Navajo creation story comes from the Hopi. And that the Hopi people are remarkably different from the Navajo people, though they share an area of the world. And the Hopi Reservation, right in the center of the great Navajo Reservation currently. The Hopi people are, in terms of their language, Uto-Aztecan. They're from the far south. And the Navajo, in terms of their language, are Athabascan. They're from the far north. The Navajo people are more akin to people in British Columbia, linguistically, and the Hopi are more akin to people in the Valley of Mexico. And they have come together into that 4 corners area of the United States, what is now the United States. And in a way, the primordiality of the Hopi has bleached and colored the mythology of the Navajo, so that the Navajo have the tint, the color of Hopi cosmology in their own cosmology. If one looks at the racial type of the Hopi, one sees somewhat akin to a Tibetan kind of physiology. The Hopi are short and always prefer to walk. The Navajo are tall and always prefer to ride a horse. The Navajo are horse people. The Hopis are walkers. The Navajo love to travel. The Hopi like to stay where they are. The Hopi feel at home on their mesa. The Navajo like to roam the Monument Valley. There's this kind of difference. And so when it comes to understanding, something like one of our texts here, the Gladys Reichardt's Navajo Medicine Men sand paintings of the Navajo, one has to understand here that there is a curious kind of mix which belongs ritually to two different kinds of people brought together, and that there is a Western logical delusion operating as the initial screen within which to see this rather disparate and swirled quality. In other words, the Navajo and the Hopi people are like Ben and Jerry's hot fudge ice cream. They're two different things swirled together, but the person who's going to eat that ice cream is wearing rose-colored glasses that distort, and so one can hardly tell what's what. And so in the past, the understanding of ritual, the understanding from that misunderstanding of ritual led to a misunderstanding of myth, led to a misunderstanding of symbols, led to a complete misappraisal of vision. Vision in ancient times used to be called magic. So that an entire ecology of development that was indispensable for appreciating the mystery of nature and indispensable for maintaining the forms of existence, was the order of the day. And the misunderstanding was compounded because as each generation passed it on, the skews developed more and more. If any of you are golfers, you know that once you mishit a ball, it doesn't straighten itself out, it keeps slicing off. The current state of education is off the playing field. They're not only not on the green, they're not even in the rough. They're no longer on the course. They're out across the street in some shopping center parking lot. There's no sense in fighting or arguing about it. There's no game in town at all. The golf course of education is empty. There's no one there. Part of the fulcrum upon which this ignorance maintains itself in its circular rut is traceable to the initial misunderstanding of ritual. And that's why we're addressing ourselves today. Not in a circularity, but in an excursion that has an ecological kind of movement. There's all the difference in the world between a dead-end circularity and a vibrant ecology. And this education is based upon an ecology of understanding. Now, everything that I've said so far is like a freshening up of a field known as the field of inquiry. And that field of inquiry has two aspects of its language that we have to perk our ears up to immediately and all the time. The two aspects are that there is a real logic, not the one you were taught to use, and that language is most accurate when it retains some incomprehensibility. And so I've been using that kind of language, that kind of logic to churn up this field of inquiry this morning. So you've been having an experience. You've been dropped into an experience of real education without your perhaps being aware of it. Coming in off the streets of Los Angeles on a Saturday morning, expecting to have an instruction, some kind of lecture, and what's been happening here is dramatic mystery play. But one that's instructive, or to correct yourselves, one that's educational. And what would be instructive is if I try to tell you something, if I try to identify myself as quite different from how I identify you, and then identify a subject matter, which is going to go from me to you, that whole circle is filled with delusion, has no logical validity in reality whatsoever. And if either of us or both of us believe in that, we are perpetuating a lie. So what is happening here is that the field of inquiry, in order to be real, needs to be, first of all, churned up. And this is the basic way in which ritual treats nature, that nature must be churned up. Whether it's on level of very early agricultural traditional societies, of beginning to plow the land in the spring, to churn the land so that you can put the seeds in for the food that's going to sustain life, or whether you're in Vajrayana tradition and you're churning the milky ocean by yogic practices that scramble the assumed. It matters not what kind of ritual tack that one takes. True learning begins with scrambling up what you thought you know. What's the old saying? The saying that was made popular in the 50s by English Zen Buddhists who were trying to teach Americans about their expertise in Zen. And one of the favorite stories that they would use is about the cup, that you can't put anything into a cup until it's first emptied. If your cup is always full and you know damn well what you know, how can you learn anything new? You have to have an empty cup in order to be given something new. It's on that level of simplicity. The square, in traditional wisdom, in ancient wisdom, was that the horizon is not made out of a conflict of polarities, but is held together by a tension of reciprocity. And that this reciprocity is distributed by a hierarchy of similarity, which is levels of correspondence. And so in a ritual comportment, the tribe was always concerned with making sure that the reciprocity flowed freely on every level of correspondence. The responsibility for the ritual was to ensure that the entire field of inquiry was churned up so that every correspondence was alive and freshened, and that the reciprocity, the energy exchange on all those levels of correspondence were free to do what they needed to do. So that in traditional wisdom, ritual is a kind of social acupuncture to make sure that the chi's flowing, both ways on every level. And if that's the case, then the tribe is in good health. They're in good health because the reciprocity between men and women, between all this twinned, parallel quality of existence, and the reciprocity between, not just between the twins of existence, but the reciprocity between existence and nature. And so out of all of the pairs that characterize existence, the primordial pair was always first man, first woman. Original man, original woman. Because pairs characterize the structure of existence. But of all the pairs in existence, first man and first woman were a pair that exemplified the pairing of existence itself as a whole with nature. And in this quality, women had a peculiar ambidextrousness, not a duality. The world of scholastic, Aristotelian, medieval, masculine logic sees women as dangers because this ambidextrousness was misinterpreted as an evil duality, characteristic of a flawed universe. What's wrong with the universe is perfectly evident in what's wrong with women. So it's not this duality, but it's an ambidextrousness. And women's ambidextrousness, in a primordial ritual sense, is that they're a pair in existence with the male, and they are also a pair on the nature side with all of existence. And so they're at once exemplary of nature and participatory in existence. And so women were the carriers. They were like the messenger RNA template for the way in which nature flows into ritual seamlessly. That nature and ritual are the same ribbon, but with a twist in it. That in nature this side shows, and in ritual that's the other side shows. But it's the same ribbon. Whereas men could lose track of the fact that it's the same ribbon and count the sides and say nature is this side and ritual is this side. They're different, they're quite distinct. And that's it. That's it. We're protecting ourselves from nature. We're protecting existence so it isn't swallowed up by nature. A typical masculine polarizing attitude. Whereas you have to twist a woman's arm for decades on end to get her to agree to that, and she'll only agree just temporarily, just to appease. It's not true to her at all. It's quite evident that that's not the case at all. What's the big deal? What's the rush about all this? And so in primordial ritual, the reciprocity on every level of correspondence is keyed, like a musical pitch pipe, by the way in which men and women have reciprocity on those levels of correspondence. And in order to ensure that one does not forget that this is an omnipresent ambidextrousness, all tribal ritual has within it collections of men and collections of women, women's societies, men's societies, that have totemic disparateness, and yet the fact that there are totems for both masculine and feminine societies is the secret link of their feminine wisdom, linking them with nature. That is to say, in nature, human beings and animals are not disparate. They're part of the same Tao. But as soon as one gets into a ritual level, human body remarkably different from animal bodies. On the ritual level, human existence is quite distinct from animal existence. And proof of it is that human existence can talk human talk, while animals can only talk animal talk. And that animals can be understood by men. Animal talk can be understood by men only to the extent that they reabsorb themselves back into nature, and on that level, learn to communicate. Whereas animals cannot learn the language of men. Animals are always in that part of the ribbon that's in nature and never make the twist into that level of ritual where language of men can be spoken. So that while animals have ritual comportment just like people, Jane Goodall's chimpanzees have a whole ecology of ritual, almost as complex as tribal society. But they never talk it over, and they never tell myths about it. Whereas men and women, the world round for all time, tell each other these myths. And structurally necessary to the telling of the myths is to make sure that one keeps the actions of the female societies and the actions of the male societies reciprocal but distinct. Parallel but paired and not blurred. Because the blurring of the male and the female on ritual level is invitation to, one, increasing incomprehension as one goes along in further developments, or of necessary regression back into nature alone in order to make it workable. Known as bestiality. So the only futures that face the confusion of male and female being are madness of further development or bestiality of regression. Now this was a kind of a peril. We talked last week about the two kinds of perils, the perils of the unlimited and the perils of the limited. This was a kind of peril that to women was a peril of false limitations, but to men was a peril of unexpected unlimitations. They saw it differently. They saw the same scenario, the same threat in different ways. And so part of the maturation of a mature mythology, the fullness, when many myths link together in a ritual year to be the great cosmological mythologies of a people, the dramatic play, that's the true structure of it, is the way in which men and women tell each other their versions, their parts, their facets of the myth. The jewel of the people has facets that only the men or women at various times can tell each other, and so they must communicate together. And part of great ritual cycles, the reason why it takes many days or weeks, is because it takes this long to make that reciprocal interchange of language. Let's take a break. Let's come back to language for a moment. Let's come back to the advisability of being attentive to incomprehensibility being a familiar quality of good language. In terms of this particular situation, someone always coming in for the first time cannot hear what's being said. And this is good in the sense that this is a learning situation, an education for what used to be called the whole person, not just your head. And not just your head in the medieval scholastic mode. And not just your head in the medieval scholastic mode, a la late 20th century skewed version of even that. That wedge of the pie is so narrow as to be untastable. That's no slice of life at all. I'm not just talking about the whole pie, I'm talking about the whole bakery. So this language initially has a lot of incomprehensibility in it because it's put there, because it's meant to be there, needs to be there. You have to get acquainted. You have to get familiar. This is the part of sacred language that used to be encapsulated about 100 years ago in the idea of the Egyptian hieroglyphic. The hieroglyphic, H-I-E-R-O, sacred. Sacred glyph. Glyph is picture. Picture symbol. Sacred picture symbol. A language based on sacred picture symbols. Not phonetic sound bites that fit into medieval scholastic logic academia, but a language whose sinuosity flows not only in that twist from nature to ritual, but another twist from ritual to language, and another from language to symbol, and another from symbol to vision, and another from vision to art, and another from art to history, and another from history to science, and another from science all the way back into the mystery of nature. So that the reality of this kind of language that I use is like twirling a ribbon that has many glints and many arcs and many sparks. So if one were able to get some kind of bird's eye gestalt of it, it would look like a scintillating waterfall of infinity signs. So no wonder someone coming in out of reactive world bounces off the first glint. Nothing happens. Why speak that way? Because wisdom truly cannot be conveyed or even held in any other way. The complement, the paired text to our Navajo sand paintings by Gladys Reichard is Black Elk's The Sacred Pipe. The 7 rites of the Oglala Sioux concerning the calumet, the sacred pipe. I will bring some of the sacred pipe material next week, the red sandstone, not in the shape of a pipe, because I don't hold any kind of traditional way to have a sacred pipe. But I do hold and have a little red sandstone turtle, a little tortoise, which symbol of origin of civilization. Now that red sandstone comes from only one place. Just like in ancient China, all jade, so-called, all neophyte came from Khotan. Well, all of the sacred pipes in North America come from Minnesota. They all come from what is now the Red Lake Reserve in Minnesota, because it's the only place that has that sacred sandstone. Now the Oglala Sioux have the Calumet because originally they were a northern Minnesota tribe. Originally they came from area that we would call today northern Midwesterners. Minnesotans call it the North Shore. It means the North Shore of Lake Superior. Most of the United States is below Lake Superior, but a section of Minnesota juts above Lake Superior and is the North Shore. And off that North Shore is Isle Royal. That's still held in pristine naturalness. Still the way the United States was 1,000 years ago. Now the Sioux, the Oglala Sioux, one of the bands of the Sioux, are now called, and historically were called, the Teton Sioux, because the most western reach of their power were the Grand Tetons. And the Grand Tetons being those jagged sawtooth peaks. When you see the photographs of your ranch at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, those mountains in the background are the Tetons from the other side. But the Tetons are part of Wind River Mountains, and usually from where the Sioux were, on the eastern side of those, they don't have that picturesque Jackson Hole, Wyoming postcard look at all. Because from the other side, those Wind River Mountains look like distant roll. And they're used to being seen from vast plains far in the distance. And part of the quality of those vast plains is that it looks completely flat and it's totally mysterious. If you're standing at a place like where Custer's last stand was fought, you can look 100 miles and see the Wind River Mountains off in the distance. And you cannot, for the life of you, understand how could several thousand warriors not be seen in that kind of landscape. And they were right there because the ravines and furrows in the Great Plains are deceptive to first glance. You don't see first glance. That whole army can be 100 yards from you and hid out of sight. Especially if you're European, carrying categories of designation with you, and these are the plains, and they are flat. And you're General George Custer with flowing blonde hair and 2 guns. I have to keep it somewhat under profanity. When you're at Custer's last stand, there's a slight rise to the land. Very slight. It's like a bump. It's like a goosebump on the plains. And right today, right next to it, is a rug factory run by the Crow Indians. But in that time of Custer's last stand, the Sioux had acclimated themselves to the plains so much that they knew how to be there invisibly by the thousands. Part of this acclimation to nature was part of the genius of the North American Indian tribes. The genius of being able to be absorbed back into nature without leaving a trace. Native peoples are called natives because they belong in the landscape to the extent they can disappear into it. If you cannot disappear into the landscape in which you live, you're not native yet. And there is such a thing that when you become native, the land accepts you in such a way that it absorbs you without leaving a trace. It's like Thoreau, who stood in a snowstorm with the trees and probably no one saw him. Not because of the heaviness of the snow, but because he was absorbed by the trees. Now, long-haired Europeans can learn to be white Indians. They can learn to be absorbed by the New World. James Fenimore Cooper's Deer Slayer, who was at another time in his life Pathfinder, was at another time in his life Hawkeye, La Longue Carabine, he had many names, as befitting a white Indian, fit into the landscape all the way until his 80s, and when he died on the prairies in the last of the Leatherstocking sagas, the prairie, the old hunter was absorbed mystically back into the land. And the Indians with him let him go back into the land. When a Scotsman named John Muir, who had loved wilderness to the extent that he had given his soul back into the wilderness, back into the California Western Sierra wilderness, back into that valley called Yosemite, the twin valley to it, Hetch Hetchy, which is now buried under water from the dam. Yosemite was one of twin valleys. And those twin valleys were like powerful resonance of Western Sierra that made California. The whole glorious golden state, Caliph, the land of the Caliph, the golden land, was golden because of those two great valleys. And Muir loved them both. And the Sierra Club fought for Hetch Hetchy and lost. The European governmental decision that we need to have dams overrode the whole sacred geography of the western part of North America. What kind of hubris? But we're talking about John Muir. Yeah, I'm talking about John Muir in Yosemite, who in his own recount, his own book on the Yosemite Valley, writes about a time when he climbed down Half Dome to see the view and to just get the feel of the wind, and how late one afternoon while he was down there, quite far over Half Dome, that he realized the sun was setting. And when he turned to climb back up, he suddenly realized he'd come down too far. And he was too exhausted. Suddenly, it occurred to him that he was physically exhausted. He'd spent the whole day in high wind, hanging on the top of that cliff face, 3,000 feet above the valley. And when he turned to climb back up, he didn't have the strength. He couldn't go. And he realized, as he wrote and writes in that book, you can read it for yourself. That's what the United States is all about, this kind of person. He suddenly gave his life to the mountain in thanks that he had been granted an existence along with it. And as he did so, he in his own writing says, he melted into Half Dome to such an extent that without an effort, he just climbed back to the top and went back to his camp. Didn't even think about it. Because nature accepts us. The Tao takes the Te back in without leaving a trace and flows like a ribbon. It's like that comic poem by E. E. Cummings. It comes out flat like a ribbon and lies on the brush. Talking about the way in which Buffalo Bill was accepted by the landscape. In his humorous poem, he says, Buffalo Bill was a fabulous man. He could shoot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pigeons just like that. Hey, but what I want to know is, how do you like your blue-eyed boy, Mr. Death? The landscape absorbs us. Nature absorbs us if we become native. And the way to keep that link is through a ritual comportment that is reciprocal with nature. Not only do we experience nature accepting us, but we accept nature. And there's a reciprocity to that. Ritual is meant to keep that bridge alive. And as long as that bridge is alive, one can go back into nature. As long as the rainbow bridge is still vibrantly alive, at the point where one would die, instead of dying and laying there like something, one can mount the pure steed and ride triumphantly back into Valhalla every single time. Or in old Iranian, Indo-European mythology, one comes to that Chinvat bridge, and Diana is there as graceful helper spirit and walks you over what would otherwise be an impossible razor's edge, over an unimaginable chasm, effortlessly. Ritual is meant to keep this rainbow bridge of reciprocity alive so that life and death are not polarities. They're exchangeable with each other. Are ancient men and women primitive because they were able to do that? Hardly. What kind of snide schoolboy effrontery is there in a Western scholastic logic that calls this life and death as polarities, men and women as polarities, good and bad as polarities, and making assignations, oh, women are negative and males are positive. And so when they hear a Navajo cosmology in their mythology that women are associated with first world, with the darkness of the first world. It's not a darkness as in bad, black, nothing. It's a darkness as in like black wool, a warmth of mysteriousness. And out of that world, out of that realm, the second world is a blue world. So that black and blue, and the people in that black world are mist people. They're not quite human beings yet, not fully there, because they do not have any definite boundaries. They're shapeshifters, all of them. They can be people, they can be animals, they can be reptiles. Because shapes shift, because the reciprocity of Tao is everything. It's all that's there. And so later on, where Slayer of alien gods is born as one of the divine twins, characterized by black flint. male version of that. Whereas the twin is characterized by blue flint. For the Navajo, the first world is world of black wool mystery. And second world, world of blue haze. And one climbs correspondence levels from the black first world to the blue second world to the yellow third world to the white fourth world and emerge finally into the fifth world where we are now. That there is an ecology of this, there's an emergence of this, and if the rituals keep alive the context, the reciprocity on all these levels, even on this world where we are really distant and far away from true emerged primordiality, we can still return back into nature and be accepted and survive an early twilight crisis with plunging 3,000 feet. You can still do it. And you don't have to be born there. A landscape can accept you. You can acclimatize yourself to a landscape. That one of man's most sacred treasures is that he belongs everywhere where he is if he establishes that rainbow bridge, that full spectrum reciprocity. With all the levels of correspondence, he becomes a native of that place. How do you think man's going to become a native of the moon? How do you think man's going to become native of other planets, much less other star systems? Because that moon and those planets and those stars are going to accept him as a native someday. Because there's no place in whole universe that we are not able to become native and be at home. But the rituals of reciprocity for that have to be practiced. They have to be done. And the language, the sacred language that comes out of that has to be sacred, which means it has to carry within it the seeds of the incomprehensible, of the mysterious. One of the best books on the Oglala Sioux language, William K. Powers has done about 7 or 8 books on the Oglala sacred language, the nature of supernatural discourse in Lakota. The language, Dakota means the unified varied tribes. Lakota is their language. Lakota is a type of language that's in a huge family of language called Algonquin. And Algonquin was the most universal language before English in this part of the planet. Algonquin was spoke from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean. James Fenimore Cooper's Mohicans spoke an Algonquin language. The Delawares spoke, and their name was the Lenape, Lenni Lenape. It's the ancient Indian name for them. They spoke an Algonquin language. The Sioux spoke an Algonquin language. The Blackfeet spoke an Algonquin language. Whereas the Navajo spoke an Athabascan language, like southern Alaska, like western Canada, like Washington State, around Seattle. The Navajos are cousins to the Blackfeet and the Sioux. They're cousins. But the Navajos and the Blackfeet and the Sioux are not related to the Hopi at all. They're not related to the Mayans. They're not related to the Aztecs. The blood types are even different. All of the Indians of northern North America all have a blood type the same, a kind of an AB blood type, because all of the natives, the far south, South America, Central America, Mexico, southern United States, It's all type A. Two different blood types, and only two, which, like the languages, the blood, like the languages, show that there were two great waves of migration separated by at least 10,000 years. That the earlier wave of immigrants across the land bridges from Asia had completely settled all the way down to Tierra del Fuego before there was a second wave towards the end of the last ice age. So somewhere about 25,000 years ago was a wave of immigration, and somewhere around 12,000 years ago was a second wave. And the Navajo and the Hopi belong to two different waves. So while they're native people, while they're Indians, they're separated by a gulf of blood and language and other kinds of differences, which persist till this day. And as long as they are in their own traditions, sacred as each tradition is, there's a lack of an interface. The membrane doesn't have full osmosis. And so there needs to be developed ritual ways, sacred language ways that permits the osmosis between them. And so a couple hundred years ago, the Navajo accepted a lot of Hopi cosmology into their mythology, allowed the actions that go with that into their ritual in order to be able to live there with the Hopi. The Navajo were the assimilators, the welcomers. And so the landscape accepted the Navajo in a broad way, whereas the landscape in a very poignant, narrowed way, first, second, and third mesas, accept only the Hopi and only them. And they feel at home only there. You don't find many Hopis who are comfortable around Big Mountain. And yet both peoples share the confluence of the San Juan and Colorado rivers, where they come together as a cosmological place. For this confluence of reciprocity, not polarities, but a confluence of reciprocities, is always a locus point, a seed point for American Indians, whether north or south, whether Hopi or Navajo. First man in the first world was a confluence of two of four corners of the universe. That the universe had four corners. Notice the square again. And the colors of the four corners were colors of clouds that rose over those four corners. In ancient Egyptian cosmology, the sky was held up by her four appendages, the feet and the hands, and they were mountains. So the Egyptian sky was held by four mountains at the four corners. In North American Indian cosmology, there were four clouds that rose over the four corners of the universe. One black, one yellow, one blue, and one white. Man was born of the confluence of black and white, whereas woman was born of the confluence of blue and yellow. Black and white have very easy way of becoming duality, polarity, whereas blue and yellow, you can't force a polarity or duality very easily. They sort of go together, like the sun and the sky. So that for the feminine beingness, the point of confluence was unmistakably a reciprocity, and it's very difficult to ever reduce it. Whereas first man's confluence can be mistaken as a duality, as a polarity, quite easily unless he remembers. And so men in the American Indian tradition need to practice, along with courage, memory. And the way that men practice memory is that they are able to speak spontaneously and carry within their language not only the good sense of speaking well of what they're saying, but carrying also woven into their language the sense of the gestalts of the wild incomprehensible still alive. And so a very good Indian speaker was always someone who could at one and the same time make sense to the other men and make sense in such a way that he also showed the wild incomprehensible edges were still within his comprehension. He still remembered. And so the ability to speak, to declaim, to be an orator was always a sign of great manliness for American Indian males. The test of whether you were a man yet or not was that you were able to speak on your own with the council fire circle. If you could not speak from yourself to the rest of the males in the tribe at the council fire, you were not yet a man, you're still a boy. Now, on that scale, North America is inhabited by a tribe of adolescents with hardly any males that are mature at all. You don't need very big valley for council fire these days for the gathering of males. You don't need much space at all. For the females, the confluence was the clouds of blue and yellow that came together. Now, where the male came together at that point, when first man was made of the confluence of black cloud and white cloud, white corn was also born same time. The seed of white corn was born, and when woman was a confluence point, yellow corn was born. And so yellow corn always symbolic of female energy, white corn always symbolic of male energy. So you see, would-be Indians practicing sacred dusting on themselves with yellow cornmeal, you have to just walk away. It's not it. There are all kinds of innuendos and details and refinements, and only because the world at large is so ignorant is it not even just seen to be totally ridiculous. Not even worth talking about. When men and women, first man, first woman, notice the pair, first man, first woman, when they come together, their fertility results in 5 sets of twins. And the first sets of twins are hermaphroditic because they're like first world. Gender is not fully defined yet. 5, again, 5 worlds, 5 sets of twins, 5 pairs. So you always get this kind of, there's a numeracy that's here that's recognizable world round. The Chinese have a 5 phase that has both yin and yang. So you have 10 heavenly stems. You always have that kind of equality. But just like in the Chinese cosmology, the center can be counted twice. When you're in a celestial mode, you count the center only once, but when you're in a terrestrial mode, then you count the earth twice. You count the center twice. Why? The key to this is still preserved in the ancient Greek understanding of heroes. In the ancient Greek understanding of heroes, a celestial hero is one when his accomplishment is over, he leaves for the celestial regions. A terrestrial hero is someone who, when his accomplishments are over, he becomes a king on earth. That ancient Greek understanding, for instance, surfaces in the high dharma of the Buddha. The original Buddha is a celestial hero. He returns back into the mystery of nature, but had a choice because paired with the Buddha is always a Chakravartin, a universal king, who has same 32 marks as a Buddha, has same heroic journey, but is a terrestrial hero rather than a celestial hero. Just so, in Chinese cosmology, the return to Earth, you have to count the Earth twice, which means that the Earth has a square. It has a pair of pairs. So that instead of 10, you get 12. You get a set of 12. So wherever you run across to 12, it's a terrestrial perspective heroism. The 12 signs of the zodiac are a terrestrial way of distributing the heavens, not a celestial way at all. The 12 constellations of the zodiac are an earthbound way of computing influences of the stars. If you go into the celestial constellations on this planet in the same correspondence area, there are 88 constellations, same number of keys in the piano. You have to master the influence of 88 constellations, not just 12. So next time some astrologer tells you how highfalutin they are, ask them about the other 76 constellations. There's a lot to know if you're going to be space cowboy. You got to be able to ride bareback. And it's not a tame stallion. The terrestrial means that you count, instead of 5 pairs, you count 6 pairs. You count 12. The 12 apostles are a sign of a terrestrial hero. A celestial hero goes forever. That Jesus goes back into divine mystery. But one who returns again has to have disciples numbering 12, has to have apostles numbering 12 to establish a return. Comes back. It's an earth-based, a terrestrial quality. In the Navajo, there were always those who recounted not 5 worlds, but 12 worlds. There was always that kind of version. But the deep primordial was 5 worlds. Now there are books like this one published at the University of New Mexico Press, Dine Bahane, The Navajo Creation Story. And it's an interesting kind of semi-journalistic presentation of the creation story. And the writer is a male journalist, tells interesting stories, but gets a lot of things confused because doesn't understand reciprocity, didn't hear in full way. The best presentation comes by a woman, Eileen O'Brien, done in the early 50s, published in 1956, The Dene, Origin Myths of the Navajo Indians, published by the Smithsonian Institution, Bureau of American Ethnology, Bulletin 163. And Eileen got it right because she listened to the old medicine man who passed it on to her in the 1920s. His name, Sandoval, was the American name for him. His Navajo name was Old Man Buffalo Grass. And she got it in such a way that this little monograph, she wrote it in Santa Fe, New Mexico, December 1953, talking about how he, the old medicine man, came to her and he said, "You look at me and you see only an old, ugly man. But within, I am filled with great beauty. I sit as on a mountaintop and I look into the future. I see my people and your people living together. In time to come, my people will have forgotten their early way of life unless they learn it from white men's books. So you must write down all that I will tell you, and you must have it made into a book that coming generations may know this truth." And so Eileen O'Brien is part of that tribe of American women anthropologists like Gladys Reichard and Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict and Ruth Underhill and just a whole swath of them. Frances Dinsmore, who was a very tough kind of parlor tyrant in the white world and was just so marvelous in the Indian world that she wrote 12 to 15 books on American Indian music, all the different tribes and their different music, because the musical forms are the way in which the rhythm of the pacing of reciprocity is handled so that all the correspondences are covered. That's how you know. You have to complete the dance, otherwise the field of inquiry is not full. So when you're churning up everything, there has to be somebody comprehensive to be able to tell when the dance begins and to what extent it goes and when it's time to end the dance, because one has covered it all. Part of handling sacred language is indispensable to this. Powers, page 14, quoting from Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, the great French writer, quoted by everybody from Carl Jung on down, the great French writer on prehistoric man, on Paleolithic mind, on the way in which man is absorbed in nature so that what he does is in a mystical participation with nature, so that man's doing, his existence, is woven into the way in which nature goes, so that his acceptance by nature approaches totality. And when he isn't approaching totality, it begins to devolve and strife comes in, and just like the Navajos, that one has to emerge, one has to climb out of the first world because strife begins to happen. Because there are other creatures other than first man, first woman. And there are 5 sets of twins. There's a pair of kind of coyote beings. One is the great coyote formed of water, and the other is first angry. Also coyote, but has propensity to fly off the trigger, fly off the handle. Pair of coyotes, pair of humans. And not only that, but there are a quaternary of wasp people that are made, and there are a pair of quaternaries of ant people that are made. The red-jacketed ants and the black ants. The black ants love strife. And so first world got so crowded that strife became a part of it. And so they had to climb out and go into the next world, the second world, the world of blue haze. which was characterized by blue-feathered beings. Blue herons, blue jays, bluebirds, blue hawks. So the blue-feathered world, blue haze. And even there, eventually, they had to climb out of that because of strife and climb into the yellow world, the third world. And even beyond that, into the white world of the fourth world. And even beyond that, into the fifth world where we are. Sacred language must tell this in such a way that it is not reduced to categorical beliefs that are seeds of disillusionment. Because the disillusionment is natural resonant of a kind of delusion that happens from untruth. And untruth is made by someone ineptly trying to speak the truth, trying to say exactly with complete perfect identity what they understand, and they, having incomplete understanding, their language is perfectly clear and carries with it the misunderstanding they have. And so sacred language always has room to breathe. It's like Dylan Thomas one time talking about a good poem. He said a good poem has chinks and breaks in the sentences, in the word structure, so the lightning and thunder can come through. I was standing in a living room one time in San Francisco in the early days of rock and roll, and my friend Steve Miller and Boz Skaggs had just come back from Sweden with his sitar. We're trying to play a duet in the kitchen, and Chuck Berry shook his head when they started to sing. And he said, "You know, you white boys are pretty good, but you try to hit all the notes. You miss a few. If the audience is with you, they'll fill them in. You got to learn to leave your music open, because that's where the joy comes." He said, "We don't call it rock, we call it rhythm and blues." Because somebody that's trapped in categorical prisons will be melancholy, but somebody who's sad in the way in which nature flows always, that's being blue. And it's cool to be blue. But it's relentlessly regrettable to be sad. Rhythm and blues. Roll over, Beethoven. Tell Tchaikovsky the news. They're rocking in 2 by 2. It's that kind of a quality. If you understand sacred language, you can hear it anywhere at any time. You can hear it around the campfires 20,000 years ago out in Montana. You can hear it in kitchens in San Francisco in 1964. You can hear it when somebody reads a quotation like this in a book on sacred language. That which proves the mystic worth and power in words, as words is the widespread custom in magic ceremonies and even in ritual and religious ceremonies of using songs and formulas which are unintelligible to those who hear them, and sometimes even to those who utter them. For these songs and these formulas to be effective, it is enough that they have been transmitted by tradition in a sacred language. In the most logical of all the Greek Hermetic documents, the Poimandres, the Mind Shepherd, there's a point in the dialogue where Hermes Trismegistus tells his son Tat that there's a point at which there's a confluence of understanding so powerful that the student and the teacher have to let their language go wherever it will go. and to let that wild language in its cascade of mystery take them along with it, wherever it's going to go. And if you cannot give yourself up to that, then there's a fearfulness that's bred out of being acclimated to categorical prisons, and you're on a devolutionary spiral. That part of the sign of health is the openness to the mystery of unknown meaning. The way the Hopi people describe it, when a baby is born, when a human is born, the top of the cranium is soft because there's a hole there. And it's through this hole that the prayers of the child are heard by the Great Father and the Spirit Mother. And one has to take care that as one grows and matures and ages, not to close off this hole, to keep the cranium open so that your prayers and thoughts can be heard. Otherwise, you're unable to send your voice. This kind of quality, Powers writes here, Levi Bruhl is one of the few scholars to call attention to the fact that even some ritual specialists are sometimes unaware of what some sacred terms signify. It means that the speaker consciously understands that they are not in full control and possession of all the meanings, but of enough of the meanings to be able to convey what they have and to give what they are. And if they convey everything they can and give everything they can, that is enough. Nature knows that you don't have it all. But when you open up to give everything that you can, that's enough. That's gift enough. And in reciprocity for you having given all that you can, nature will return all that she can to you. All that you can absorb at this particular moment will be given to you, bestowed to you, a gift to you. So that there's a reciprocity. That the gifting, the giving, is a mystery of exchange. And what is exchanged is whatever is capable at that moment of saturation. The ancient high Jewish code of charity was Maimonides. That charity is always anonymous on both ends. Nobody knew who gave and nobody knew who received, and how much was never known. One gives as much as one can openly, and one receives as much as you can absorb openly. And on that level, true charity happens. Anything else is a kind of mean ledger keeping of prisoners, criticizing from their cells. This quality of language, that truthful language always has a modicum of incomprehensible quality to it, means that our incomprehensible seeds in the meaning which we give are returned back to us by nature as future possibilities that we didn't even think of. Now, the extent of everything that we can understand and imagine and think of is infinitesimally small in comparison to the possibilities of the real. The real has such protean oceans of facets that we haven't even begun to hear about. Dimensions and possibilities and probabilities that we couldn't compute even at the end of this next millennium. Nevertheless, they're still viable in the matrix of change, in the soup of the actual. And we can be nourished by this. So that the Sioux, sacred person, like Black Elk, who was one of the best sacred medicine men that the North American Indians ever produced. Black elk, really somebody special, really extraordinary. When you see the photographs of black elk in the books that are published, he looks like a tired old man, and he was. When Joseph Eppes Brown first came across him, he was in his 80s picking potatoes in a field in Nebraska, dressed in rags. Don't let appearances deceive you. Like a Dharma teacher that I knew who went to China about 65 years ago to study under a great Chinese Buddhist master. And he was met in Shanghai of that day by coolie with one of these peak hats on and nose running with stuff and rags. And he was abrupt to him all day to get him to the master. And only the next day did he find out that was the master. You came to study with him. And of course he did what any good master should do to a precocious student like that. He ignored him. He ignored him the whole time he was there. And of course he turned out to be a very good Buddhist, because he had to struggle with that fact. There are times in which wisdom is conveyed exactly by the right person for the times. They give everything, but all that is seen is only what can be absorbed at that particular time. And there are some times when there's nobody that can absorb it, when the room is empty. One finds oneself solitary. It's mythological origin of yoga. Well, if you're there by yourself, you might as well disappear by yourself. The great example of that was Milarepa. Milarepa is such a powerful yogi that his ashram, his monastery, was Mount Everest. And he meditated in a cave on the north side. And he sat there, and all that he had was the dew that collected in his open hand and the occasional pine needle that would fall into it, that would make a kind of a weak green soup. He would heat the hand by his tumo, and he would live on that, and he lived on that for so long that he turned green. And of course his hair grew and untended, just matted, so that when some robber band came into the cave to divvy up their loot, they didn't recognize as a human being at all this green matted lump sitting in the back of the cave, till he spoke to them and scared them so badly they passed out. And out of compassion to them having passed out, Milarepa came out, cut his hair, began teaching to revive them and bring them out of this death fright that they had suffered, out of compassion. And that's how the great ashram of the Kargyupa lineage began to really flourish. The truthful yogi carrier is quite different from what one would expect. In the Sioux and the Navajo traditions, the medicine person is always a confluence of male and female coming together, but always coming together in pairs. So that there's not only holy man, but there's also holy woman, also holy boy, and also holy girl. So that really powerful confluence is of these four, this pair of pairs that come together. And their structure is so iridescently real that all medicine paintings have a 4-part mandala-like quaternary, because they're there in the very structure, the bones in the way in which any kind of symbol is made. Always there. And that one can symbolize it easily by taking both your hands and grabbing both hands of another. and coming to meeting, and four hands coming together like that. Every single time, just something that simple is that linking of the deep core of reciprocity and the way in which similarity comes into a special kind of resonance. When similarity comes into resonance in equanimity, resonance transforms into harmony. And the peculiar thing about that special resonance of equanimity, the harmony on any level is harmonious with the harmony on all levels. So that one then can speak of a harmonic. And the harmonic is a chord that runs through the whole universe. And if you touch it on any level, you've touched the entire chord. You can resound the universe as a bell by touching it on any level of correspondence. So most ritual will choose some special level of correspondence where it will, for that speciality, for that ceremony, that will be its focus. Our reciprocity, our similarity, our correspondences, our symbolism, our mythology is all going to now, in this ceremony, focus on this level. And so there's a comprehension that flows out of this. And so ancient wisdom has a real large perspective of truth. And when the ethnologists came with their European categorized mentalities, a la a kind of a medieval scholasticism, and would ask them what their myths were and would write them down, in all truthfulness, the Indian informants would always give them different versions because there were different days, different circumstances. And in comparing notes, the Europeans decided that the Indians themselves were liars. They didn't know their own traditions, that mythology is forever untrustworthy. And so the implements of these people, the sacred implements, were dumped into dustbins of little prison places called museums. And that's the way things were up until the 1920s. The most dusty, forgotten places in the world were museums of American Indian ethnologies. Almost nobody cared. All that was changed by things like the American women anthropologists and by the medicine men like Miguelito, medicine men like Black Elk, medicine men like old sweet buffalo grass. These men, these old medicine men, found American Indian ways to speak to European women so that there was a reciprocity. The wisdom of the male Indian medicine men was preserved in the books of the female anthropologists in such a way that later on those books could be opened, and the books were in such a way, arranged in such a way that they would divulge their secret sacred language in ways that would reestablish a harmonic in the future. When we come next week, I'm going to speak a little bit more about Black Elk Speaks, about the way in which Black Elk Speaks links with the Sacred Pipe, how these two books, about 20 years in between, show a kind of a calibration by Black Elk, an appreciation for the way in which the ear of the white North Americans was becoming acclimatized to the land. and that the land itself was beginning to accept them. There have been very few who have become at one with the land so that it has been absorbed by them. We live in a time where, for the very first time, human beings have set foot on the moon. And the very first acceptance of the moon of someone occurred in the dream of one of the astronauts who was there, Jim Irwin. He was there with the last Apollo mission. And he had a dream. And in the dream, he and Harrison Schmitt were driving in the lunar rover far out into the lunar landscape. And they got so far that they couldn't see their LEM, their lunar excursion module. And off in the distance, they saw another lunar rover driving over the landscape and drove to meet them. And when Irwin looked, it was he and his companion who were in the other lunar rover.